So as context, this is a graphic that's often presented at forestry events, which is the annual planting rate in terms of hectares over the last century. It was relatively small up to the 50s. Then as we had the Whitaker report, it grew flat. It peaked in the 90s and has gradually declined over the last 20 years or so to a relatively low amount at the moment, about 2,000 hectares, which is about 8% from the peak in 1995. There's a lot of discussion around the forestry sector at the moment, and there's a new strategy and a new grants program, which is welcome, with very significant increases in budget. So it's great to see that perspective at government level. But when I look at the sector over a century, I see a success story. We had 1% of our land area in 1922, and now we have 11%. It's the biggest land use change since the foundation of the state, and it's now twice the area of crops, fruit, and horticulture. So to make that amount of change is very significant. And as we look at, we're at crossroads now in terms of where we want to go, that we can again look backwards to go forwards. The economic position of planting forestry is good. This graphic is from some work we did using the Teagasc National Farm Survey, which basically finds that more than half and up to 70 or 80% of beef and sheep farmers will be better off with forestry. Now we see a fall off in planting rates at the moment, and so there are wider behavioural challenges, particularly things like the replanting obligation. Something else that we find when we look at people who actually planted, it's not just a straight forestry land use change, but rather farmers do other things when they plant forestry. They look at forestry as part of an early retirement or a gradual retirement strategy, or for another proportion, they look at it as part of as a diversification strategy. Forestry, maybe increase their stocking rate and maybe have off-farm jobs or other things. A multifaceted approach to income generation on a farm. Later on, we're going to hear from my colleague David Stiles, who will look at scenarios into the future, and just taking one of the graphics from his work in terms of looking at forestry. In this work, they looked at what types of scenarios would deliver carbon neutrality by 2050. And of the 166 scenarios that achieved carbon neutrality, the mean land area required was 18% for forestry. We're at 11% now. And interestingly, this is almost exactly the same as what the Department of Agriculture produced in 2014 to COFORD in terms of its own strategy, and that still remains government policy. The challenge now is because we've missed our targets in recent years. Instead of having to plant 14,500 hectares to deliver that target by 2050, we now need to plant 20,000. That is a big ask. This is a graphic of the targets in straight lines over time, going back to the Programme for Economic Recovery in the 50s, right up to the current Climate Action Plan. And the jagged line are the number of hectares planted. And we kind of followed the targets. We were pretty close to targets over the 70s, 60s and 70s, 50s and 60s. We overachieved in the 90s, and we fell back later. But our targets fell with the decline in the numbers we were planting. But our goal has to remain the same. If we don't deliver forestry in terms of the 18%, we'll have to find other ways to reduce the emissions. We were in a similar position in the 70s when we joined the EEC, when there was a higher return from agriculture and the planting rate fell. And Frank Convery, who was a professor in UCD, wrote a very important report, the 1979 NEST report, which had a very detailed and multifaceted strategy, focusing on not just financial incentives, but financial, behavioural, organisational. And that led, because we implemented many of the details of that report, to a very significant recovery and an overachievement of targets delivered by the Department of Agriculture in the 90s. So I guess the lesson from that is we had a challenge before, we found solutions, and we delivered. And I guess we're in that position again, but at least we have the confidence that that we were able to deliver in the past. In preparing this work, we also looked at the Food Harvest 2020 strategy, where, if you remember from the previous presentation, we over-delivered on beef and milk, and we missed our targets in forestry. Since 2011, that lowest point, the number of cattle increased by 865,000. It's actually got up more in the most recent numbers. So that's equivalent to about 386,000 livestock units. Every hectare of forestry sequesters the carbon emissions from 3.8 livestock units. That means that it would take 102,000 hectares of forestry to mitigate the emissions from dairy expansion. However, we missed the planting target by 112,000 hectares in that period. So the conclusion is, if we had met the target, we could have had carbon neutral dairy expansion over that period. That's an important lesson. If we project out our carbon numbers, because we increased our forestry, our planting rates fell, and that high-level planting will be harvested in the next decade or so, we know that we will have what's known as a carbon cliff. As we harvest, our emissions will reduce, will increase, our sequestration will fall, and we'll have something like this, that flow of carbon over time. We can't control that. That's already happening. But what we can control is the depth of that cliff. And the more we can plant now, the lower that cliff will be. And the more likely it is we can hit those 2050 targets. If we delay implementing that forestry strategy, it will seriously impact our capacity to deliver carbon neutrality by 2050. Carbon is a challenge. The carbon neutrality is a challenge. But at least in forestry, it presents an opportunity. The state places a value on carbon. We see that when carbon taxes are applied, when we fill our cars or heat our homes. We place a value on the emissions we produce. In the same way, you can argue that that value is the value of the carbon we save when we sequester carbon in trees. At the moment, it's about €40. That would rise to €265 in 2050. So it's a very valuable resource, the carbon that we sequester in trees. When we look at the percentage of farmers that would be better off planting forestry, when you value the carbon, we call it the social return. We see that at €32 a tonne, it increases across all sectors, but at €100 per tonne, the value in 2030, that in most sectors, the return from private, so market and carbon value is higher for forestry than most other sectors. It effectively means a radical change to the economics of forestry versus agriculture if you can find a way to factor that carbon value in. If we look at the agriculture support structures, grants, premiums, tax relief, on the current scheme, that's worth about €32 per tonne, which is the 2020 carbon price. In the recently announced programme last week, and this is for SeQUE with a bit of biodiversity, it's €48 per tonne, and both of those are for yield class 2022, which is the 2023 carbon price. So that's a welcome improvement. But as that carbon price, which is a Department of Public Expenditure Reform price, rises up to €265 per tonne, there are very significant opportunities to further incentivise afforestation that yield a positive cost-benefit return. Final two slides about strategy. We need both short-term carbon sequestration delivered by fast-growing conifers. We need that because it can deliver carbon quickly, and we also need the timber from those trees to decarbonise the construction sector. But we also need broadleaves. We know that in the long run, they can sequester carbon. They do a bit more slowly, but they can be good carbon sinks, and they're probably better, they are better for biodiversity and better for recreation. So we need both. It's hard to get all objectives from one forest. We need to plan for different types of forests. We also need to think beyond just purely carbon. We need to think of carbon, water, biodiversity, recreation. We need to think about multiple benefits. And to enable this to happen, because it's a substantial change, both for landowners and for communities, we need to focus on, firstly, their concerns, and then to think about the behavioural changes required for people to make this decision, because we need a lot of forestry over the next 30 years to deliver on our goals. And we need to communicate it better in plain English. So my final slide are some of the other recommendations. I focused on carbon incentives, on behaviour. We need to focus strategically. We need a land use strategy. We have lots of aims for our land, but many are in conflict. We don't have a way to prioritise at the moment. We need to focus on behaviour. So things like dealing with licensing, which is improving an awful lot in fairness to the department. We need to integrate forestry and agriculture when we plan CAP and not treat them as separate sectors. And also we need to change our business model. Business as usual won't deliver the gains, or it will be very difficult to deliver the gains. We need to go back to the Convery report and think, what do we do right to get those changes in the 90s? We need to implement the McKinnon report, which has detailed regulatory aspects. I think a lot of people are calling, myself included, for a forestry development agency. There's a difference between forestry, development and regulation, different risk profile. And also, while agriculture and farmers will deliver a proportion of afforestation, we need to think broader than that and multiple actors. And so when we need to deliver forestry from different sources for different purposes beyond purely timber, we may want to consider where is best to headquarter or centre forestry in government. So thank you very much.